Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and today I want to talk about extraterrestrial gardeners, cases in which ETs are taking our plant life. It's pretty much accepted that ETs have been abducting people for quite decades and collecting genetic material. There are many cases of ETs collecting animals as well, abducting animals. And of course, their interest in our planet seems to extend to the plant life as well. So there are many cases in which ETs have been seen taking plants of all kinds, and several cases in which ETs have very unusual effects on plant life. So yeah, that's what I want to talk about today and see if we can figure out what's going on because some of these cases are really weird. First case I want to talk about took place in 1991 in Puerto Rico to a couple by the name of Albert and Marisol Camacho. First strange thing they noticed was when their neighbors approached them and said that they had seen a UFO hovering over their house. The Camachos hadn't seen anything at this point, but it was just a few days later that Albert Camacho did see a strange craft hovering overhead, darted away, and it was a few days after that that Marisol Camacho was woken up early one morning by activity on her front porch. And she looked out her window and got a real shock. There were two small figures there with big, bald heads, large dark eyes, wearing jumpsuits, and they seemed to be very interested in her Swiss cheese plant. Swiss cheese plant is also called the split-leaf philodendron. It's a common house plant, but it does have some medicinal properties as well. And yeah, they seem to be very interested in it. In fact, as Marisol says, they were taking leaves off the Swiss cheese plant. They were stripping her plant of leaves. And so she starts to open the window and they look up and run away. But it was only a few days later, there was a repeat performance. The ETs were back on her front porch. She heard activity again, looks out the window, and sure enough, there they are, surrounding her Swiss cheese plant again and taking a few more leaves. So it's a very strange case. What interest would ETs have in a common house plant? Hard to say, but there's quite a few cases like this. A very well-known case took place in Valençol, France, to a farmer by the name of Maurice Mass. Maurice is a lavender farmer. He had a field of lavender flowers, which is used for soap and other uses. And he was having a lot of problems with missing plants. This is in June of 1965. He noticed that some of his lavender plants were missing, just completely gone, and he could not figure out who was doing it. Until July 1st, 1965, he wakes up early one morning to check on his plants, and he catches the perpetrators red-handed when he sees this object drop down from the sky and land in the middle of his lavender field. Two figures come out and start plucking his lavender flowers. He approaches, and one of them takes this little device, like a pistol, points it at him, and Maurice finds himself completely paralyzed. These two figures take the lavender plants that they had collected and go back into the object, which takes off straight up. It's an amazing case because it left very prominent landing traces, which caused quite a bit of attention, and Maurice became a little bit of a celebrity, and which was not what he wanted, and did not want all this publicity. But yeah, it's another case of ETs taking plants. And there are quite a few cases like these. Researcher Artie Six-Killer Clark has a couple of these kinds of cases. One occurred not that long ago, 2010, around there. She doesn't give the exact date. This occurred in Honduras to a farmer by the name of Hector. He saw a UFO hovering over his cornfield in Honduras, and this little man suddenly appeared in his field. He was wearing a full-body brown suit and started collecting ears of corn, which he would take and put in a little pocket in his suit. So Hector was watching this, and so was Hector's brother. Hector's brother decides to approach, at which point the little figure sees both the men and paralyzes them, apparently. Both Hector and his brother were unable to move as the man took the ears of corn and floated up into the flying saucer, which took off. The two brothers were unable to move for another hour and finally did recover, were very weak, and actually suffered long-lasting ill effects from this encounter, which are still persisting today. Weakness and things like this. So yeah, ETs are taking our plants. Here's another case. This occurred on September 10, 1965. It was investigated by Jim and Coral Lorenzen. There was a farmer in Pernambuco, Brazil. His name is Antonio Pau Ferro, and he was out in his maize field, his cornfield, when he sees this object come in for landing. It doesn't actually land. It floats about 1 foot above his cornfield, and he sees 2 3-foot-tall humanoids emerge. They're normal looking. They look like little humans. They're clean shaven, have a reddish brown complexion, and are wearing tight-fitting one-piece suits. One of them approaches the farmer, walks right up to him, and starts speaking in a foreign language. Antonio cannot understand what he's saying. He's pretty frightened, and one of the ETs picks a tomato, and these 2 figures return back into the craft, which takes off with a loud hum. And he was not the only witness. Many people in this area heard the craft as well. Another case occurred. This is also from Jim Coral Lorenzen. This occurred in Pontal, Brazil, on December 4th, 1954. Jose Alves was fishing on the Pardo River when this typical flying saucer drops down, and he sees 3 little men in tight-fitting suits, and they immediately start taking samples of various plants. He said they took samples of the grasses and the herbs and various leaves, and actually took a little tube and filled it with water from the river before suddenly leaving. That was December 4th. It was only 5 days later that there was another case nearby. This is also investigated by Jim and Coral Lorenzen. This took place in Brazil, but to a man by the name of Olmira da Costa. And he said on December 9th, this cream-colored object hovered over his farm, and all the animals scattered. There were 3 humanoids that he saw. 2 were on the ground, and 1 was in the ship looking down. One of these humanoids approaches Almiro. He drops his hoe. One of the humanoids picks up the hoe and hands it back to him. Meanwhile, the other one bends over and starts picking some of the beans and maize plants and heads back into the craft. Olmiro, his farm animals start approaching, and he offers to give them one of the farm animals, but they don't seem to be interested in that. They just want some of his plants, and that's what they did. They took the plants and left. And it was literally 2 days later and 1 mile away that there was another case. I'm thinking these are probably the same ETs. This was also investigated by Jim and Coral Lorenzen, though many years later, RD 6 Killer Clark located this witness and also got an interview with him and got the same exact story. This is a farmer by the name of Pedro Morales, and this took place in Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. 1 mile from the above case. Pedro first noticed something unusual when his chickens started making a fuss. He went outside to see what was wrong and saw this object. He says it was kind of brass in color and very loud, making a sound kind of like a sewing machine. and comes in for a landing on his field of beans and corn. And there are two figures on the ground, one in the ship. The farmer describes these figures as being of about medium height, broad-shouldered, they had long blonde hair, pale skin, slanted eyes. This description is important because there's another case with the exact same description. At any rate, he said that they were wearing brownish suits, or perhaps yellowish suits, and were more interested in the tobacco plants than the beans and corn. At any rate, he sees them in his tobacco field, so he runs towards them. One of them holds up a hand in kind of a warning gesture, and immediately one of them bends down and picks a tobacco plant and returns to the craft, and the other enters the craft, and this craft darts away, making a loud humming noise. Following this incident, the farmer did notice that one of his chickens was missing and has never been seen since this incident. So presumably they may have taken one of his chickens as well. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of cases. Another one from 1954 in March occurred in Santa Maria, Brazil, to a farmer by the name of Ruben Hellwig. He came upon a landed UFO and two male humanoids looking mostly like normal humans, wearing jumpsuits, and one of them was collecting samples of grass. He later had a repeat encounter where he was able to speak to them briefly, and they told him that they were interested in this area, Brazil, because it was very rich in natural resources. Bud Hopkins, of course, had a very famous case. This was the one that got him interested in UFOs. This occurred in November 1975 outside the Stonehenge Apartments in New York. The main witness is George Obarski, who saw little humanoids out in the park there digging in the grass. And it turns out the park attendant had noticed these strange little holes appearing and could not figure out who was doing it. But yeah, these were deep holes that actually took all the grass all the way down to the roots. So it appears that the ETs were taking samples of grass or soil. So yeah, these guys are collectors. They're collecting all kinds of plants. Here's another case which comes from MUFON. This occurred in May of 1982 in Newport, Virginia. The main witness is a field engineer at a shipyard. He was woken up around midnight one evening to see this bright light shining through his window, through the shutters, from the backyard. And he gets up and peeks through the shutters, at which point he becomes paralyzed, unable to move. The light finally blinks off. He's a little frightened. He waits the next morning to go out into the field and doesn't see anything. There's no evidence that anything was there. But 2 days later, he goes out there again and sees that there are 3 perfectly circular rings, about 12 feet in diameter, all right next to each other, kind of forming a little triangle. He's very puzzled. It looks like they're made out of sort of a fungus. They're sort of donut-shaped. And he sees his neighbor out in the back of gardening and brings a sample of the grass and shows it to him. And his neighbor says, "Oh yeah, this is a common fungus in the area. It grows in kind of an outward growing pattern, making little circles, maybe 2 feet in diameter, 3, but usually takes 2 to 3 weeks to form." And the witness is like, "No, these circles appeared overnight," which they both found very strange. And here's where the story gets even stranger. And I'll just quote from the engineer who was talking to his neighbor. This is what the engineer says. "He then showed me several places where some of his azaleas were missing. The dirt was still fresh, like they were pulled out by the roots. There was a footprint about 5 or 6 inches long near the plants. It looked like someone was wearing swimming fins with no obvious toe or heel marks. He thought some kids stole the flowers at night. He had several varieties of azaleas, and it appeared that at least one of each color was missing. So yeah, here's another case where ETs are stealing flowers. Why ETs would come from light years away or wherever they're coming from to collect flowers, it's hard to say, but there's enough cases to say that they are in fact doing this. Here's another one, also from 1954, by the way, November 4th, 1954. This took place in Arezzo, Italy. The main witness is a lady by the name of Rosa Danieli Latti. She's 40 years old. She's on her way to visit a grave site. It was a very dewy morning. The grass was filled with dew, so she took off her stockings and was walking barefoot, holding her stockings in one hand and a bouquet of carnations in the other, when she comes around the corner into a field and sees this weird object, like two cones placed together, and it's there, landed in the field. And there's two short humanoids standing next to this object. They're very friendly, they're smiling, and she approaches. They seem very friendly at first until suddenly they lunge forward and steal her stockings and her carnations. This frightens her pretty bad, so she runs away and turns around. She can still see them there. This object then takes off, and turns out she's not the only witness. There were some other people in the area, two children, who saw the whole thing, the little men and everything, and watched this object take off. So again, here we have ETs stealing flowers. Another case from MUFON took place in February 2006 at Waynesville, North Carolina. This is another very strange case. The gentleman, a main witness, says he saw this UFO hovering over a Norway maple tree, and it was bending the branches and stripping them of all the newly formed buds and leaves. So whatever this object was, whoever was inside it, they seemed to be very interested in this Norway maple tree and the newly emerging flowers coming from it. Probably the strangest case I found of this kind took place on July 22nd in 1978 in Phoenix, Arizona. This is again a case from MUFON. It occurred at 6 p.m. A man was sitting outside his home with his friend when they heard a very loud, thunderous sound. This was followed by a brilliant flash of light, and there was this rotating silver craft very low overhead. It appeared to be triangular in shape, and then something very strange happened, and I'll just quote the witness here. The first craft, says the witness, emitted a beam that lifted a 40-foot cactus out of the ground and fixed the sand so the earth looked untouched. Both craft then disappeared as they had arrived in a brilliant explosion of light. The witness ended up moving to New York because this incident rattled him so much. He's still in touch with his friends, and as he says, I still keep in contact with my friend, and this always comes up in conversation. Yeah, I bet it does. It's a very strange case, which I would disregard except for the fact that there are so many other cases like this. One case that I investigated myself took place in 1953 in Livingston, California, to a group of Philippine immigrants who owned a strawberry field and were out there early one morning picking strawberries when 3 UFOs dropped down and surrounded the strawberry field on 3 different sides. One was very close. This was a tiny little craft. It couldn't have held more than 2 little people because it was maybe 10 feet across, 5 feet high, totally silent except for a soft whispering noise. The main witness heard a message in her head that says, "Don't be afraid. There's no reason to fear." And while they did not see this craft actually do anything, it was clear that they were very interested in the strawberry field. They stayed there for a good 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes before finally leaving. Another very interesting case comes from Whitley Strieber, who had joined a UFO abductee support group and heard this case from a lady by the name of Mary, who was a cosmetologist from New York City. And she had experienced repeated abductions throughout her life. At least 10 times, she believes, she's been abducted over a period of 25 years. Her friends and family have all had experiences. She's seeing ETs that are the commonly described grays with large bald heads, large dark eyes, short and gray skin. And she says that she had a very interesting experience. And I'm quoting Mary right now. Says Mary, "For a whole year, I was obsessed with taking some little piece of the world with me. I took my children to the park, and I collected every little seed and rock and twig that I could find. My whole room looked like a nature study. Then half the stuff turned up missing." Mary didn't see how this turned up missing, but she speculates that it was the Greys, and that they were kind of using her as a proxy to collect various plant life and seeds from our planet. She feels that the ETs are probably benevolent and are just there to study. And there are some cases, I think, that show this. A very interesting case comes from researcher Diane Tessman. She's a MUFON field investigator and has been researching UFOs for decades. And she reports on this very interesting case, which took place to a farmer by the name of Jan de Groot in Amsterdam, Netherlands. Now, this is a place very well known for growing tulips and flowers. And it turns out Jan was, in fact, a tulip farmer. And late one evening, this is on September 24th, 1989, he returned home to see that one of his greenhouses was glowing with a strange light. So he goes to investigate and is really surprised to see this huge object parked behind his greenhouse. It's a saucer-shaped craft, easily the same size of his greenhouse or larger. And he sees this human-looking person dressed in a strange jumpsuit who immediately approaches the farmer and gives him a message. The ET told him, quote, "Your tulips are getting too much irrigation. They can't take that much water, you know." And that's all John remembers. He blacks out, wakes up the next morning in his bedroom, and goes to the greenhouse to investigate, and sure enough, he's surprised to see that his tulips are being overwatered. Turns out there was a leak in his irrigation system, and the tulips were getting overwatered. And so apparently the ETs advised him on this and told him that his ETs were in fact his tulips were being overwatered. Another case from Diane Tessman occurred in Ireland, in County Tipperary in Ireland. This was on October 31st in 1990, and the main witness's name is Jerry, and he's a forestry worker. Now, this area of County Tipperary is a beautiful area filled with all kinds of really beautiful trees, and it was Jerry's job to watch over this forested area. And while he's out there on patrol, he sees this very bright object come flying out of the sky in what looks like an aircraft accident. That was what he first thought, was that an airplane had actually crashed, because this object came down quite swiftly. So he starts hiking towards where he saw this object came down and is confronted by a strange looking humanoid. It's a normal-looking human, but has very long hair and is wearing sort of a weird jumpsuit. And this figure told Jerry that the poplar trees in this area were very sick, and then proceeded to give Jerry a highly detailed and scientific explanation on how to cure these poplar trees and other trees of various diseases. So they spoke for some time, at which point the man just suddenly walked off into the forest. Later that evening, Jerry saw this object again, zigzagging through the sky, and became convinced that he encountered an actual extraterrestrial who was prescribing cures for various tree diseases. And there were other independent witnesses, at least 3, who saw UFOs on the same evening. Jerry was impressed enough that he went to the Dublin Agricultural Experimental Centre, where he shared the knowledge that he was given by this strange man in the forest. So yeah, there's more evidence that ETs are very interested in plants. When someone's taken on board a UFO, usually they're physically examined, perhaps. Perhaps they're shown hybrid babies, or taken to the control room, or given warnings of some kind, shown disasters. But in some cases, people are shown something much stranger. It might be the last thing you expect to see on board a UFO, which is basically a forest. And this is what happened to Raul Manuel of Belize. This is a very early case. The first encounter occurred to the main witness. His name is Raul Manuel. He was 8 years old when he had his first experience, and this was in 1918. He was pulled up into a UFO, typical UFO. He said it had metal walls, corridors, and finally he's being led around and taken into a room, and he couldn't believe what he saw. And I'll quote here, this is Raul talking. "A door opened and I walked into an area that was like a forest with trees and flowers." He was shocked. He says the ETs were very short, had dark slanted eyes, white skin, and white hair, very much like a previous case. And these ETs wanted Raul to help with studying and planting the local native trees from this area of Belize. So this turned out to be the first of many encounters in which the ETs would abduct Raul, and then they would take him down into the forest, and Raul would show him plants. And here's Raul talking again. "Each time I went there, I taught them about plants. I taught them as my grandfather had taught me about our medicine. They encouraged me to point out medicine plants in the forest. They would gently dig them up under my guidance, and later I would plant them in their garden in the sky. The garden contained trees and plants from all over the world. There were birds, some I had never seen, vegetables and fruits from all over the universe." So yeah, these UFOs are in fact very much like little arks, little Noah's arks, if you will, where they're collecting plants of all kinds. And that case is not at all unique. Another case almost exactly like it comes from John Mack, who interviewed a lady who he calls Catherine. And in Christmas of 1990, Catherine was taken on board a UFO. She was first given a physical examination. She was then taken to a room where she was shown hybrid babies. But it was the next room that really shocked her. As Catherine says, and I'm quoting, she says, "I'm confused, but it's there. It's in the room, and there's like trees and rocks and dirt and things off to the left. I can see them from where I am." It was a full, complete, totally natural pine forest. It smelled real, it felt real. She said it was pretty large, this room, about the size of a high school gymnasium with curving walls going upward on all sides. And after being led through this forested room, the ETs led Catherine out of the ship and back to her home. Another very similar case occurred to a family from Molalla, Oregon, the Twiggs family, who had repeated experiences that started out as pretty scary abductions, but evolved into a very unusual contactee case in which the whole family would be taken on board and visited with these mostly human-looking ETs. And these ETs had a very large craft in which they had an area which was devoted to plant life. And I'll just quote the Twiggses here. Here's the Twiggs talking. The vegetation on the mother ship, for the most part, seems very much like the forests of evergreens here on Earth, specifically reminding us of the Black Hills of South Dakota, although the trees are not as tall. Yet they do have other plants that are not familiar to us, like their firebush, a 3-foot-tall bush in which a red liquid courses through the almost clear branches. From a distance, its luminescent qualities and movement make it appear to have a fire dancing across it. There is also a tree in the shape of a giant banana whose bark resembles something like the shape of a pineapple. So yeah, here's another case with not only earth plants and trees, but all kinds of different plants. Betty Andreasen, I've quoted her in a number of my videos, and you won't be surprised to hear her saying something very similar here. In her case, she was taken into a room which was a perfect reproduction of a little pond in a forest. In fact, it was so convincing to Betty that she initially thought she was outside. And as Betty says, and again I'm quoting here, I'm in the woods. I don't know how I got here from there, but I'm in the woods. It's so green and beautiful, and there's a pond right there. The water is so clear. I can see fish there. Oh, wow. It's just loaded with fish, loaded. All sizes of fish in there. In such a small pond, too. And I can see ferns, and it's just so beautiful. She didn't see any sun or any source of light, but the whole area was evenly lit and quite bright. And as she's watching this beautiful scene, the pond suddenly drains, and this is when she realizes it's actually an artificial pond. It's metallic, and the ETs explain to her very clearly that they are saving our planet and all the plants and animals and people, for that matter, from total extinction. As Betty says, and this is her quoting, he says that they are the caretakers of nature and natural forms, the watchers. They love mankind. They love the planet Earth, and they have been caring for it and man since man's beginning. They watch the spirit in all things. Man is destroying much of nature. They are curious about the emotions of mankind. He's saying that they have been collecting the seed of man, male and female, and that they have been collecting every species and every gender of plant for hundreds of years so that nothing will be lost when the last shall come. So that's a pretty chilling message and falls right in line with the many, many messages people have received of ET's warning of environmental and ecological destruction. So that seems to be the purpose behind this worldwide collection of plant life. And it really goes beyond, just collecting plants and growing them on board UFOs. There's some very weird plant effects that occur. I'd like to talk about a few cases like that. This next case comes from researcher Jacques Vallée. It occurred on August 2nd, 1978 at Valonconcello, Italy. And the anonymous witness saw this UFO land in a field of grass. The object left burn marks in the sort of strange jelly-like substance on the ground. And for 2 years, no plants would grow where this object had landed. Then, about 3 years later, in 1981, this area underwent a strange and unexpected transformation where this area where the UFO had landed became, quote, covered in moss and small cactus-like plants that were not typical of the area. So these were not necessarily alien plants, but they certainly weren't native, and there's a number of cases just like this. Another case occurred in Corvallis, Oregon on November 12, 1973. A woman called the local newspaper, the Gazette-Times, to report what she thought was a crash landing of an airplane. So local police were sent to investigate, and they found this large scorched area. And not only that, there was this strange wild fungus that was growing there. And what was very strange about it is that the species were not native, and they were not only not native, they were oversized, much too large than the normal fungus. So that's strange. Another case I investigated myself occurred in Canyon Country in California. This is the Santa Clarita area. It occurred on November 16, 1991, to a witness by the name of Robert Murphy, an X-ray technician, who saw this UFO, a red and black object, kind of rectangular in shape, hovering over the fields behind his house. He observed this object through binoculars for about 15 minutes before it finally departed. The next day, he went out there to investigate and found areas where the grass had been crushed. But not only that, he saw, a few months later, this weird growth. And I'll quote Robert here. It says, Robert, there's a whole lot of growth, new growth of wild onions. I think they're wild onions. It's all breaking ground now, coming through. I was just wondering if heat or anything could cause onions to spring up or something. So while this growth is native to this area, it was very sudden and perhaps even accelerated. And in fact, there are a number of cases where UFOs do accelerate the growth of plants. One case, again from researcher Diane Tessman, is a really interesting case. This occurred in June of 1991 to a woman by the name of Ita in Belfast, Ireland. She was going to bed when she saw this UFO, this object, hovering over her garden in her backyard. She first thought it was a helicopter, except there was no noise, and it was a very, very bright light, and her whole garden was just glowing with light. And it stayed there for about 10 minutes, and she thought, perhaps she was having a religious experience. She didn't realize what was happening until she looks out there and sees that this object is actually spherical in shape and takes off straight up into the sky. So she goes to investigate the next morning and got a real shock. It turned out that her garden the plants in it were much larger than they had been before. This was a newly planted garden, and now it looked as though 3 weeks or a month had passed, and the plants were much, much larger in size and towering over her neighbors' gardens. The neighbors were very shocked and asked her what happened. And here's what Ida says, and I'm quoting Ida. When people asked me what I did to my garden this year, I lied and told them I had a secret fertilizer because I didn't want the fallout of people laughing about my UFO encounter. So she kept it secret. But yeah, this is another case where ETs accelerate plant life. And it's not the only one. Another case from researcher Jacques Vallée and Bill Murphy occurred in Redding, California in April of 1976. The main witness is Jean Kirk. Jean was watching TV when suddenly her TV blacked out, and looking outside her backyard, she saw this strange cloud-like object moving overhead. At the same time, the neighborhood dogs began barking, and this object moved off. So in the months that followed, where this object hovered, the weeds in the area began growing extremely fast and surpassing all the others in size. Normally, the weeds in this area would grow to a maximum height of about 3.5 feet. By April of 1977, she says these weeds had grown to an amazing height of 8 feet. And even the grass in this area was growing about 5 feet tall and continued to grow for another year before finally stopping. Another really interesting case occurred to the James family in Colorado. This was in 1967. They were in their trailer, and were in Colorado on their way to California, actually. And suddenly this object, shaped like a child's top, but much larger, hovered over their trailer and sent down a strong beam of light which illuminated the interior. And the next day the object hovered again over the trailer. And following this incident, they couldn't believe what happened. They had this carrot that they were growing next to the window. And I'll quote James here, Jerry James. Jerry says, "Something drastic and truly puzzling had happened to his carrot. For the carrot did not resemble a carrot any longer. It had spread out as if having grown for weeks in a tempered professional hothouse. Roots were everywhere, running outside the dish and reaching almost to the floor." Now, carrots are known for getting quite large, but they certainly don't grow feet overnight, which is what happened in this case. So yeah, a lot of interest in plants on the part of the ETs. And sometimes this transfers to abductees as well. One lady I interviewed who had an abduction experience during the Topanga Canyon UFO wave of 1992 to 1994. She was in her home. This is actually in 1991 when this occurred. When she had a visitation by an entity in her bedroom who physically examined her. It was initially pretty frightening, but ultimately she was not hurt. And she visited James Harder, who hypnotized her and told her, that he does not believe ETs are here to harm people. So she takes a pretty benevolent view towards all this. But what's really interesting is she says she had a personality change following this incident. And I'll just quote her. About what happened and how she changed as a result of this encounter. Says the witness, "I've become very much involved in the environmental field, not necessarily politically, but on a personal level. I'm not sure if this is tied into my own ET experience, which I now believe actually occurred. I've had 2 visions that came as dreams. The first being to save seeds, plant seeds. So I've been doing that. I've also become a total vegetarian, although I've been leaning in that direction for years. But of all the fresh fruits, particularly, that I eat, I will save the seeds of grapes, berries, peaches, plums. Anyway, my family thinks I'm a bit nuts, but that's okay. I collect their seeds too. Don't throw away your grape seeds. Please, I'll take them," she tells them. And the second vision that I had was to grow beans. I'm going to become a bean farmer before this life is over. And I don't think those 2 visions are unrelated in the experience I had. I think they're somehow tied in. So yeah, another case that I think might be related is a very famous case, well known in the literature. It occurred on April 24th, 1964. In Tioga City to a dairy farmer by the name of Gary T. Wilcox, who saw a UFO land in his field as he was spreading fertilizer. And he approached and saw that it was a metallic object, and there was a number of strange-looking humanoids in black suits. And It was a large egg-shaped object, maybe 20 feet long, 16 feet wide, made of shiny metal. And two small male humanoids were standing next to the craft, dressed in seamless uniforms, and each was carrying trays heaped full of earth that appeared to have been removed from his field. And so he ended up having a long conversation with him. They gave him some prophecies, which a few of which ended up coming true, and they wanted some fertilizer and were interested in why he was spreading it in the field, and he explained what fertilizer was, and so that it helps grow plants. And so they asked him if he could get if he could give them a bag of fertilizer. So he went to get a bag of fertilizer, and when he returned, this craft was gone. He left the fertilizer there, and when he returned the next day, the fertilizer was gone. So yeah, it's a strange case, but he's got character witnesses, his own brother and other people, and the case is pretty much considered a classic in the literature. It's never been proved to be a hoax or anything like that, and fits in with all these other cases. So yeah, this is pretty interesting stuff. I did a study of these cases in my book, Not From Here, Volume 2, to try and figure out what's going on. And yeah, it just appears, like Betty Andreasen said, they're collecting various species of plants, perhaps in an agenda to save them from being destroyed or becoming extinct. And that seems to be the agenda behind it. And yeah, they're collecting species of all kinds. And this matches up very much with their warnings of environmental destruction and upcoming ecological collapse. So for that reason, I think these cases are very important, and people should know not only that we may be up for some very rough times, but that ETs are collecting plants, all kinds of plants, because of it. And I think this is also good advice for us, and that we should start taking care of our planet for one thing, and everyone should start gardening themselves and becoming more self-sufficient so that we don't have to go through hard times. At any rate, that's what this video is about. ETs collecting plants from all over the world and trying to save us from destroying our own environment. That's it for now. Thanks once again for watching, and keep having fun.